So good afternoon, everyone. So this is joint work with actually a large team working on this DINA France papers. Bertrand Garbati at Crest, Jonathan Goupil at University of Lyon, Malka Guyot is now in Belgium at Liège, and Thomas Piketty, you should know, is at PSC. So I don't need to do the motivation for the DINA project. I think Andre did that very well this morning. It's a good thing. So the disconnect between the study of inequality and the macroeconomics and the evolution of national aggregates. So basically the DINA project is to create these data series at the micro level of inequalities that fit the national aggregates, that can cover all the distribution from the bottom to the top, including the top 1% or even further top income, and pre-tax and post-tax income inequalities. So for France, we have now a number of papers that I've done for pre-tax income, for wealth inequality. Actually didn't contribute to these papers. My co-authors did that, and today I'm going to show you basically adding the post-tax income inequality over a century, so since 1900 to 2018. So it's actually a lot of work to actually just do the few lines I'm going to show you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time actually discussing the methodology. We'll actually show you the result and trying to discuss a bit what we can measure in terms of redistribution and how we should interpret measures of the extent of redistribution and what implication we should have. That will be the focus of my talk. So when we think about public policies, and as André was mentioning, I focus on actually at the Institut of Public Policy in Paris to think about evaluating public policies, the impact of redistribution, tax and benefit system, and so on. So we typically think about redistribution policies as policies that affect the gap between the pre-tax and the post-tax inequality. And there is sort of the mechanical operation of tax and transfers and the redistributive aspect of public spending, of in-kind spending. And typically the way I was trained, perhaps many of you in sort of public economics, you think as, pre-tax is sort of exogenous given, and then you think about how to optimize given behavioral response, how much redistribution you want to carry on with the tax and benefit system at large. But we also know that there are policies that will impact pre-tax inequality. The concept of predistribution policies really come from political science, who have pushed that concept, but the economists have known for a long time that some policies will affect pre-tax income inequalities. Here I list some of them: the legal social system, the education, healthcare policies will all have impact on distribution of skills and therefore distribution of labor income. Think about the behavioral response to taxes. All can impact pre-tax income inequalities. So that's what we have sort of in the back of our mind when we want to then estimate what is the role of policies in reducing inequalities. So this paper is basically our aim, our research objective is to try to estimate, to quantify the contribution of redistribution and pre-redistribution on inequality. Our first contribution is mostly methodological contribution. The fact that we construct, actually a lot of the time dedicated to this paper was to do that, to construct long-term homogeneous series of post-tax income inequality for France since 1900. Then trying to go beyond the sort of DINA 3, that is going to DINA 4, using the terms of André of this morning, that is to add the fact that above disposable income, there are the impact of in-kind public spending that is likely to matter for post-tax inequality. And we'll have a bit more detailed breakdowns since 1970, where we use exhaustive administrative data and we have more information on that. But more perhaps substantially, the contribution we make, and I will insist on that contribution today, is that we think about developing a very simple framework to think about what here's the measure of redistribution we can make, and how different this is from actually the total impact of public policies on inequality. And I think this is an important aspect, and I will try to show you with the example of basically France and the US, for which we have now a long series of pre-tax and post-tax inequalities, how measure of redistribution can or not be used as a good inference for the impact of policies. And actually, you'll see that this paper actually asks more questions than really answer. Perhaps this is the typical of research, but in a sense, compared to the effort we put into building these series, we were left with a lot of these questions of what actually we can measure in terms of redistribution. So first, sort of preview of results, if you need to leave the room very urgently. So 3 findings. The first finding is that we're going to measure the extent of redistribution, so how much basically policies, in-connected tax and benefit system, and in-kind benefits do reduce inequalities in France and in the US. And basically, all the data from the US is from the paper from Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Sales, and Gabriel Zuckman. I won't mention that again. I mean, it's all, we use the data directly, and we compare to the French data. And what do we find? We find an increasing, basically, extent of redistribution over sort of the very long period of a century. And we find, perhaps surprisingly, at least it was surprising to us, that on all our measures of the extent of redistribution, France and the US pretty much compare, sort of roughly France doing a bit more, but compared to all priors,
Apparently the projector is overheated and needs 90 seconds to cool down.
So can I go on without the slides? And then when the slides come back. So I'll go on without the slides. So the first finding is that we find increasing redistribution, and it's about the similar level in the US and in France, and that's surprising. So one way to think about why do we find this, and this is the second sort of result through our very simple conceptual framework, is that actually if you want to compare countries or one country over time in terms of the extent of redistribution, you need to think about the possible impact of policies on pre-tax inequality. Why? Because if a country basically have some public policies, like think of education, that leads to lower pre-tax inequality because higher skill level at the bottom, lower level inequality, then what happens is that redistribution, the extent of redistribution will be lower. Why? Because that country will have lower pre-tax inequality, and therefore the measure of redistribution will just be lower than a country which has higher level of pre-tax inequality that will use mostly its public spending in redistributing, but actually end up with a higher level of inequality at the end. So the measure of redistribution will be impacted by any policies that actually feeds onto the impact of pre-tax inequality. It's coming close. So that will be the second finding, and I will try to give you more examples of that. And that sort of leads to think a bit more carefully about what we measure in terms of redistribution. The third main findings is typically the results that we have in comparing France and the US over time. First of all, we document a long-term fall in inequality in France over the period from 1900 to 2018. And most of that fall is due to fall in pre-tax inequality. About 3/4 of the fall can be attributed change in pre-tax inequality. Only 1/4 can be attributed to the change in the redistributive power of public spending. If we want to make comparison across countries, it's absolutely clear that overall inequality is lower, much lower in France than in the US, but it's entirely due to difference in pre-tax inequality. Or level of the redistribution level cannot explain the difference in post-tax inequality between France and the US. It's almost entirely explained by the pre-tax inequality. So basically, what would be the conclusion of that paper and that talk is that we need to pay a lot more attention to basically the impact of policies on pre-tax inequalities, because they might matter a lot. And the other sort of conclusion, which actually follows very neatly from the presentation this morning, is that we need more countries to have pre-tax and post-tax long-term series to try to identify whether this comparison from France and the US holds true for more variety of countries, and whether these results hold more generally. I will skip the related literature, income inequality literature, progressivity of tax systems, determinants of pre-tax income inequalities. Most people in this room know most of that literature, and it's not even exhaustive. It's a very large literature. Let me sort of present the outline of what I want to describe, go over the conceptual framework where we think about redistribution and pre-redistribution, and try to clarify what can be measured and what cannot be measured, the data methodology, and then results in terms of the long-run evolution of inequality, and how do we account for the change in post-tax inequality that we document. So in terms of conceptual framework, let's start from what is the standard way of thinking about redistribution. The standard way of thinking is think about inequality pre-tax, high pre, and then look at the tax and monetary transfer system, T, and how does that lead to disposable income inequality, high DISP. Or if you want to frame in terms of DINA here, and all I'm going to show you later will be how do we move from DINA 2 here to DINA 3. That will be the standard way of thinking. And the way to measure, and basically here, this gamma will be redistribution, is how much of that inequality is reduced when we move from pre-tax to the disposable income. One limitation that we talked about this morning is that that fails to incorporate the type of public policies that are in kind, and typically that can be a large part of public spending. Typically in European countries, we devote a large share of public spending to health, education, and other in-kind public spending. So basically what we're going to, in this paper, do is try to make an attempt to incorporate, and you'll see that there are assumptions to be made and they can be criticized, but basically we try to incorporate these public spending, education, health, collective expenditure. We're going to make variants to try to see whether there are results depend on these assumptions to allocate such public spendings. And then we end up with a more sort of standard, so more comprehensive measure of redistribution. How do we move from pre-tax to post-tax, including all the impact of in-kind public spending? So incorporating all the tax and public spending, how do we move from pre-tax to post-tax? That's going to be gamma. So if you think about on what depends redistribution, gamma? Well, it depends on T, on tax and public spending, but also it depends on the pre-tax inequality, by definition. The thing is that pre-tax inequality, so it's important to have in mind, is that so gamma will be increasing with the level of pre-tax inequality. With more pre-tax inequality, the role of the tax and benefit system will be larger because there will be more to actually reduce simply because of the high inequality you start from. So that will be captured in the measure of gamma. So this is the first warning in terms of comparison. If you think you want to compare a high-tax country with a low pre-tax income inequality, you can have similar level of redistribution from a low-tax country with high pre-tax income inequality. Simply because with high pre-tax income inequality, you can actually reduce inequality more by a given level of tax. André?
That's true for the numerator if you put the one also in the numerator. But if you scale it down with the pre-tax inequality, then that no longer holds. Because you express it in relative terms to the pre-tax inequality.
So in any way where you want to measure how much, so basically in any way you will try to express the fact that you want to go from the pre-tax to the post-tax at a given level of tax and public spending. So think about T as a function of redistributive function. So you can have more or less of that redistributive function, and you apply it to something which will be more or less unequal from start with. So an extreme case, you have a country who has no pre-tax inequality, or very little. And there will be no margin, basically. You will never capture a big impact of redistribution because the redistribution will have no impact. So I don't think... So you suggest to divide gamma by the level of pre-tax inequality to scale basically redistribution level by the level of. Okay, I need to think about it. I won't have an answer like from on the top of my head. So the second limitation I want to add, which perhaps is a bit more fundamental, is that pre-tax income inequality is not exogenous. It's not only so basically public policies can have a direct effect on post-tax income inequality, but also an indirect effect through pre-tax inequality. So again, if I take only one example, think about education policies could lead to higher skills at the bottom of the income distribution and then to lower pre-tax inequality. So two countries spending the same amount, but one country spending more for education that has more effect to pre-tax inequality, the other countries doing less of that policies that have a possible impact on pre-tax inequality. That country that basically invests more into policies that have an impact on pre-tax inequality will show up as having lower level of redistribution. Which is counterintuitive because we tend to think that that will be captured by a sort of high tax country that spend more to be mechanically impacted. Well, the fact that we have a potential linkage of policies to pre-tax inequality blurs that relationship. So when we observe pre-tax inequality, we have two things. We have the indirect effect of tax and transfer system on pre-tax inequality. And we have something that we're going to call I0, which is the counterfactual inequality level that also can be, different across countries for reasons that are not linked to the policies implemented. But that we don't observe. So if we think about gamma redistribution, we need to formalize what we have called predistribution alpha. And predistribution alpha is what? Is how much T has an impact to go from I0, that counterfactual inequality level, to I inequality of pre-tax. And that's the total effect of public policies. What we have intuitively in mind is how all policies go from that counterfactual level inequality to post-tax inequality, which is basically the product of two things, of how policies affect pre-tax, alpha, and the redistribution, gamma. So one thing that leads directly from that simple remark is that when we measure relations of gamma, that is, how do we go from pre-tax to post-tax, that will depend on alpha. And the higher alpha, the lower the measure of redistribution because of the, what we call the attenuation effect, because policies that affect pre-tax income inequality will then lead to a reduction in the measure of redistribution from pre-tax to post-tax. And that remark means that if we simply compare gamma across time and across countries, we might lead to misleading conclusions, because we might say, oh, actually, one country is doing more redistribution than the other, which might not be right simply because that country is actually spending more on policies that impact pre-tax inequality relative to the other. And that's quite important to keep in mind, and typically, in the case of comparing France and the US, we think that this is a major issue. So I've given you that example. It's the same thing about comparison over time. If you compare two countries, one country that invests in education and one country that will say, I don't invest in education, I do spend the same thing, but in apparent redistribution, after 10 years, the country that invested in education that has led to lower pre-tax inequality will appear as doing less redistribution, even though that's clearly not the case given the impact of the policies I've had on the pre-tax inequality. So what's the implication of that simple sort of framework? Well, the big question is, can we assess then the contribution of redistribution and pre-redistribution? Well, what we're going to do is to compute post-tax income and pre-tax income, and we have two countries to compare. And you'll see that we'll be able to compute redistribution, to assess the contribution of what is redistribution and what is change in pre-tax inequality, but we won't be able to show you or to tell you what's pre-distribution. Why? Because we don't observe I0. We'll only observe pre-tax change and the pre-tax to post-tax and tell you which are the contribution of these two parts. But then the alpha will not be identified. So now I come back to the data and methodology. So this is where we come back to more sort of DINA concept. Luckily, André has done the work this morning, so I don't have to do, I just need to translate in terms of DINA numbers. So basically, pre-tax income is DINA 2, that is pre-tax, but leaving aside all the aspects of the contributive insurance system, typically pensions, out of the framework. Disposable income, that's DINA 3. That's where we take into account all taxes and the monetary transfers. And we end up to that measure, which is comparable in typical surveys and the DINA, what has shown André. And post-tax income, that's DINA 4. That is, you do DINA 3, and then you add all transfers in a form of in-kind and collective expenditures. So, I don't need to give you too much details about the French tax and transfer system, so otherwise we'll be there tomorrow. The data source, basically, it's very much in the DINA spirit in terms of national accounts. The key difference compared to what André has shown you for Belgium is that we use microfiles of income tax returns since 1970. Which basically makes the bulk of the microdata on which we rest the estimates since 1970. We use also household surveys to complement when the tax files are missing. And we have, for before 1970, we use both series of national accounts made by economic historians and tabulations from the tax authorities, which are much cruder and not as detailed as the what we have in terms of microfiles, for which basically since the 1990s we have the exhaustive tax files, and since 1970 we have a very large sample. To go from pre-tax income to disposable income, we can simulate precisely with basically a micro simulation model based on the microfiles, all the monetary transfer and taxes. So that's, in a sense, well done. Then we need to make some sort of imputations, basically, when the tax base is not recorded in our data, typically for wealth taxes, property taxes, and redistribution taxes, where we use proxies of the tax base. And then we impute basically the remaining taxes based on some rules of tax incidence for consumptions. For instance, will be borne by consumers. Corporate taxes will be allocated proportionally to financial income. There are a number of assumptions here that are well worth to be discussed, but I won't tell you more at this stage. And then there is a question how to include, basically how to go from disposable income to post-tax income. That is, how to estimate the distribution of in-kind transfers and collective expenditures. So I think it's a very, the main reason why most studies don't do that is that it's very difficult, and basically instead of making assumptions, it's a quite reasonable statement to say, well, let's leave that aside and focus on disposable income. The problem that, given the framework I've told you, leaving aside these in-kind or collective expenditure, but typically in-kind expenditures like health, education, actually might matter a lot. So what we did is to try to rest on the few studies that have done that for France very precisely by trying to estimate basically the distribution of education spending by individuals across the distribution of income by healthcare, so based on microdata. So to be fair, there are some of these studies, but they do not cover 1 century of public spending. So what we have used is basically use the recent study to then make assumptions for the entire period. That's, you can basically criticize that, but basically that leads us to a baseline scenario, at least for which when we have studies that fit the type of redistribution that is being carried out. So basically, that will be lump sum imputation of healthcare and education expenditure, as what we observe in recent studies is that this is close to be lump sum, whereas it's proportional imputation for disposable income of collective expenditures. Again, we have done different scenarios, either on lump sum basis, all or all proportional. It will be important to make progress on all these things, but it will not matter a lot, the different scenarios, for the type of result I'm going to show you today. So, some graphs in terms of the long-run evolution of inequality in France versus the US. So this is the post-tax income inequality in France since 1900 to 2018, where we compare basically the top 10%, the middle 40%, and the bottom 50%. So the top 10% is in red, and basically what you will see, if I have my in red, basically up to the 1960s or mid-60s, France and the US will be on a very similar pattern with a big drop post-World War II. And then there is a divergence of the top 10% between France and the US, quite marked, where the US has this increasing trend for the top 10%, whereas France is still declining and then remaining at pretty much the same level. For the middle 40%, it's very close. And, oops, sorry. And the bottom 50%, at the same time, you have a divergence where basically a reduction of that share for the bottom 50% in the US, while it's still increasing in France. If we want then to compare pre-tax and post-tax, because that's going to be the point of this paper, is to see how much basically is done in terms of redistribution in these two countries over time. So France is on the left and the US on the right. So why in the US it started in 1962 is because they cannot make the going back in time. So in the splits, they only can get the top 10% in the US going back in time was for and they have the bottom 90% in their estimates. So, whereas we can split a bit further back in time, but that doesn't change basically the comparison. So, what do we see? Well, we see that for France, you get this sort of gap between pre-tax and post-tax that is increasing post-World War II, Whereas in the US, the gap is already sizable, sort of much earlier on, but doesn't really change over time. What you see also is the bottom 50%, where the gap is increasing in France quite significantly, whereas it's not changing in the US. And remarkably, for the sort of middle 40%, there's not much difference in either country. If you want to have the structure of taxes as a percentage of national income to compare, and we're comparing two countries with very different tax systems. So on the left, this is France. So at the top, the level overall is much higher than the level in the US. In dot, this is the contributive social security contribution, mostly to pay for contributive pensions in France. And this is a big part of total public spending. And we have a big indirect taxes, whereas in the US, as you probably know, indirect taxes represent a much smaller share of total taxes. And the big difference also is that the progressive income tax in France is relatively small, whereas it's much bigger in the US. Why? Because in France we have mostly sort of flat income tax and basically social security contributions that can fund the welfare system, and not so much the progressive income tax. So very different tax system. If we want to look at the distribution comparing the tax paid by pre-tax income group over time, so we have here, we're comparing, so 1970 to 2018, so it's data where we have the micro data very thin for both countries. So what happens, you had in 1970 a very, and this is sort of point in the pre-tax income distribution, P10, and then it starts to, a G percentile, a top 5% excluding a top 1%, a top 1% excluding a top 0.5, and so on to zoom in within the top 1%. So in 1970, the US, very steeply, so progressive taxes that have been mostly reduced. So it has been reduced at all points of distribution, but at the very top, much more, and that's the reforms basically in the 80s in the US that have lowered to the top marginal tax rate income tax. France, on the contrary, so France is a higher level, but also in the 1970, but the difference between the top and the bottom in the 1970 is not that big. So the shape, the progressivity is not very strong. Why? Because mostly indirect taxes, mostly social security contribution, and not so much income taxes. And what has changed? Well, the system has become more progressive in terms of taxes, and in part this is due to change, mostly due to change in social security contributions that used to be capped, basically, and therefore not paid by top incomes, and now are reduced at the bottom of the earnings distribution and been uncapped. So there's been a movement, basically, of increasing progressivity in France for the tax system. And structure of transfers. Well, they are much higher in France than in the US. The big difference, of course, is healthcare, where healthcare is a significant share of basically public spending in France rather than the US. It's also monetary transfers that is more important in France, but think about the difference. I mean, this is typically when you look at disposable income, you will capture the green part, the monetary transfer, but you will not capture the big difference in terms of blue healthcare expenditures, which actually, in terms of size, matter enormously. This is average monetary transfer received by the different sort of groups, France and the US since 1970. So what is there to be noticed there? Well, basically, France is higher than the US, but in France, every group, including the top 10%, receive a significant amount of money transfers, and but the bottom 50% much more in comparison that they counterpart in the US. So this is for sort of the descriptive statistics. I mean, it's all descriptive statistics. So, but anyway, now let's move to measuring redistribution. So the way we think about it as sort of or indicators will be ratios between the average income of the top 10%, which we note T10, and the bottom 50% income group, B50. And then we will compare pre-tax ratio to post-tax ratio of these indicators, and then we can do lots of alternative indicators, top 10 to bottom 90, top 10 to middle 40 to be bottom 50, the Gini index, the tail index. As was heavily mentioned this morning, some people disagree about the use of which index. One of my co-authors has a very strong view on not using the Gini, so this is in appendix, but you can look at all the indicators you want. And in this case, sometimes it matters. In this case, the results, the comparison of what is the contribution of pre-tax and what is contribution of redistribution is not affected at all by any of these different indicators. So if we take the recent period, 2010 to 2018, and we compare France with the US, and let me focus on these sort of inequality indicators. So basically, we have a pre-tax in France with a pre-tax ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 50 of 8, which is then reduced to 3.9 after all the tax and benefit system and the in-kind and transfers. And basically, that's a gamma of 51%. We reduce inequality of 51% from going from pre-tax to post-tax inequality in France. In the US, the pre-tax inequality is much higher, 15.7 of that ratio. It's also reduced by the system of public spending and tax and transfer in the US to 8.4, so higher than the pre-tax in France. But that's quantification of redistribution, 47%. It's actually of the similar magnitude of the redistribution carried out by France. But at the end, there's much less inequality in France than in the US, but as I will point you later, this is not because of the gamma being higher in France than the US. It's because of the pre-tax inequality being higher in the US. And that's true for all the other measures you can check, and that will be something that it will be true for that last period, but you will also, I will show you it's true also for the other period in time. So that's this gamma. This is plotting gamma across for every year for France and the US where we have the data. And what do we see? We see an increasing trend in that measure of gamma, of change in from so reduction in inequality from pre-tax to post-tax for that measure, and relatively similar level for the US. Please. So here it's equal split among adults. So this is the sort of definition where, so within, so basically, so it at the individual level, but the, for example, the number of kids will not be included through the inequivalent scale. Yes. So that's, so I think you're right in the sense that this equal split within the household, you know, you could have less than the equal split in your household, and therefore the true redistribution going on in your household will be basically, so it would be maximum under that measure, whereas it could be lower. You're absolutely right. André?
For my clarification, so if you speak about top 10 and bottom 50, and you have two income classes, pre and post. That's for a fixed rank, namely on post-tax. I mean, the bottom 50 are identified by being the bottom 50 and the post-tax income, or is this another group in the pre-tax, partially different group in the pre-tax and in the post-tax?
So it's a very good question. Your question is basically, so if there was re-ranking between the distribution and, so And quick answer, so no, it's not fixed at the pre-tax. We redo the distribution at the post-tax, and we compare the bottom 50% pre-tax and bottom 50% post-tax. So it would be a problem if there is re-ranking. If there is no re-ranking, then there will not be a problem. And we have tried to check how much and in which cases we have re-ranking. So from the analysis we have done, we have not found so many cases where the re-ranking matters, but I think it's something, you know, that could be that should be checked more, perhaps more carefully than what we have done. But so far, no, we do very simply a distribution post-tax compared to distribution. I think basically that's not a major issue for what we show. So that's the same measure, but for the top 10 and the bottom 90. So the additional insight we can gain with the US data, we can go back to 1913. So what I find interesting in going back in time is that you find all this period of the, you know, Roosevelt. At the time of Roosevelt in the US, there's a lot more basically policies that do carry out redistribution in the US than in France. And France is sort of catching up later on by basically changing both its tax system, introducing new policies for spending. But it's a wrong view that to think that France has always been this high tax, high redistributive country that so we observe now, and after World War II, there were very little basically spending, and the tax system was very much influenced by indirect taxation with little progressivity in the tax system. Yes. So you're right. You're right. Basically, the inequality post-tax is still higher in the US. Yeah, but I think the point of the paper is that the inequality is higher post-tax in the US than in France. But when we think about how much, basically, what can explain that higher inequality post-tax in the US versus that lower level of post-tax inequality in France, that's not how much, basically, we're going from pre-tax to post-tax. It's just how much the difference in inequality pre-tax. That would be the main point of our paper. And the key thing is that you should not just see that as, oh, the US is redistributing as much as France. The measure of redistribution as going from pre-tax to post-tax is a similar magnitude, but starting from very different level of pre-tax inequality. So I'm not sure the entire, so I'll think about it. So I'll take your point about the fact that here we only see by seeing the ratios, and so but I don't think that will change the story in terms of what is the share that can be attributed to the you know, going from post. So basically showing the raw data of what's going on from pre-tax to post-tax. I mean, basically, even when we look at the raw data, you see clearly that what has been going on is going on. Basically, it's all the pre-tax change that explain the change or the comparison. And when we add the post-tax, yes, the post-tax is lower inequality, but that doesn't help you. And you see visually that this is not what's going to explain the difference, neither across time nor across these two countries. But so I don't think that will matter for the result, but I understand that your point about actually perhaps showing the absolute value first, or trying to incorporate that in the talk. I'm going to skip that. That is all kind of variance we have done. The fact that I skip it doesn't mean that it's not important, because there are a lot of assumptions that needs to be checked, whether they matter, whether the imputation of any kind and transfers, whether different variance to account for the redistributive component of pension and employment benefits, alternative imputation of consumption taxes. All these could matter. And for the main result, they do not. But I still think it's important that it's not obvious, at least it was not obvious to me, that they should not matter. So how much can we account for, basically, how do we want to decompose, basically, over time, the change in post-tax inequality? How do we explain that? And we're going to explain that by a decomposition between the change in pre-tax income inequality, the change in the redistribution due to tax and cash transfers, that is going to disposable income, and then from disposable income to post-tax, that is to the change in in-kind and collective expenditure. And what do we find is that basically the change, for example, in France over the entire period in post-tax income inequality is a reduction by 75%. 45% can be attributed to pre-tax inequality, and about 21% for tax and cash transfer, and 9% for in-kind and collective expenditure. So the redistribution is doing a part, but the biggest part will still be to be attributed for France for the change in pre-tax inequality. And that will be the same for the US. So for the US, we can do that for the more recent period. And the change in pre-tax inequality, that is the increase in pre-tax inequality since the 1983, will be mostly driven by the increase in pre-tax inequality, and then a bit counteracted by the change in tax and spending policies. Same thing about if we want to decompose the difference between post-tax between country A and country B, that is here in the US and France, how much is due to the gap in pre-tax income inequality and the gap in redistribution. And then this is even clearer if you want to take, and this is the same basically insight from the raw data, is that on our main indicator, the ratio between France and the US, so there's 53% less inequality post-tax in France versus the US, and 47% can be attributed to pre-tax, and only 5% to the change in redistribution. And this is sort of the graph summing up, basically, how do we explain since 1962 the change in the ratio of post-tax inequality between France and the US. In blue, this is the contribution of pre-tax, in red, the contribution of redistribution, and, well, it's mostly pre-tax inequality that is the driver of the difference between France and the US. So, the conclusion, it's a type of paper where we end up with something we had not completely anticipated when we started to work on this post-tax income inequality. We had the prior that, you know, France was spending more, was having a more redistributive social welfare system than the US, and then we expected to document that. And then our first measures of redistribution show that the extent of redistribution basically, of course, has been increasing, but is not markedly different from the US and in France today. Even though post-tax inequality is much higher in the US than in France, but the difference basically should be attributable to difference in pre-tax inequality. Should the the conclusion, the wrong conclusion from that work would be to say that basically France is redistributing as much as the US. Well, no, that's not the right conclusion. The right conclusion is we don't know, because part of what France is spending perhaps has an impact on pre-tax inequality. Perhaps healthcare spending, education spending has an impact on pre-tax inequality. So there are two ways to, very polar cases to say. One is to assume that all change in pre-tax inequality are exogenous. And then you will say that everything we observe is only the redistribution from pre-tax to post-tax. Another completely polar alternative would be to say that all change to pre-tax inequalities can be due to government interventions. Well, both of these polar alternatives are probably wrong. How much basically policies can explain the different level of pre-tax inequality, I think is still an open question, but it's key. If we think that what we so far have with these two countries is that this is the major driver of change over time and change across country in terms of inequality. So we will need to do further research on that. And I think we need more countries, so that reinforce the case for Belgium to add 1 point to this comparison. Thank you very much. So I think in the pre-tax, you will have all sorts of changes, including change in the composition of households, that will in fact pre-tax inequality. And that's one example where within pre-tax inequalities, it's not only government interventions. Clearly, we see impact of wars. We see things that happen that are in a form exogenous to policy interventions. But there is likely to be also some policy interventions. How much of that change in pre-tax inequality can be attributed to different policies then becomes a lot more important than at least we thought or priors when starting that work. I think we were very influenced by the tradition of public economy. I mean, I've done a lot of optimal taxation and think, well, the distribution, exogenous is fixed, and then you try to maximize, to attain this objective of tax and benefit system conditioning on the objective of social redistributive power and the behavioral response. But then if actually the pre-tax income inequalities is largely influenced by the type of policies you implement, which actually, when you think about it, it's not rocket science, it's a very basic statement, but then it has big implications of how we want to measure the impact of policies and therefore the impact of redistribution. I think that's the key point of the paper. So I think you're right, and I will say you're right in saying that there is a dynamic of both income distribution inequality and the impact of policies, and that dynamics is perhaps very important in both informing inequality in pre-tax, the type of policies that can take time to but also the fact that some of these policies, and we have not talked much about the pension, what is at the life cycle level, cannot well be captured by annual measures of redistribution. So it's certainly true, but I think that even if you put aside the dynamics, there is something about the fact that policies can think about another type of policy that can be regulation, that can have an impact on pre-tax. Think about minimum wage, think about regulation in the labor market that can have an impact on pre-tax inequality. Well, that's a role of policies that directly feed into pre-tax inequalities that then will impact our measure of redistribution, which I think we have to be more aware of that indirect sort of impact of policies. So since 1970 to 2018, we have a very precise estimation of both tax and benefits through an exact micro-simulation model that for each household and then individuals, we can compute transfers. For before 1970, we have a more rough imputations where we have less information in basically at the micro level. So we need, for example, to impute some of the education, some of the transfers more based on a subset of variables. So the imputation is probably less good before 1970. But starting in 1970, this is very, I think, accurate. So you're right that, so first of all, we used the latest studies by INSEE to try to see how, but this is only done in recent periods. So we used that for the recent period, but of course we make an assumption that this was equally true for spending, 50 years before, which could be really questioned. The second point, I think you're right here, we attribute basically the government spending on education to households who have kids who will benefit, depending on their age, of the spending of the education of that time. And another way to think about redistribution completely different is to think about the individual as a kid receiving free education that then will lead, which I think it's a fair point. Here we do as if basically we are giving this money to the parents of the children.